George Washington Carver by Minnie Timenti. George Washington Carver by Minnie Timenti. The Nature Kid. Susan Carver stood in front of her cabin home while a little boy emptied his pockets. The boy's name was George. Susan and her husband Moses had cared for George since he was a baby. George had been out wandering in the woods again. George loved the woods near the Carver farm in Missouri. He always brought back plants, insects, rocks, frogs, and an occasional reptile. Aunt Sue didn't mind that George collected things. She just didn't want his collections in the cabin. Susan and Moses Carver knew George had special gifts. Why, the young boy had planted his own garden in the woods. He had even done experiments with soil and sunlight. Not many farm kids did that. Most people who knew George thought he was a genius. I wanted to know the name of every stone and flower and insect and bird and beast. I wanted to know where it got its color, where it got its life, but there was no one to tell me. George Washington Carver. One smart kid. The Carvers were determined to get George a good education, but the schools nearest to his house were for white children only. When George was about 12, he was sent to a school for African American children. The school was 8 miles from the Carver's farm, so George lived with a family who had a house close to the school. George went to a school for African American children like this one. But the school was too easy for George. He was by far the smartest boy there. George left the school and moved to Missouri, where he could get a better education. In high school, George was a star student. After George graduated, he started his own laundry business. But George still had a thirst to learn more. He wanted to go to college. The College Challenge. In 1885, George got a letter from a college in Highland, Kansas, inviting him to attend. But when George arrived at the college, they turned him away. They hadn't realized he was African American. Like many colleges at the time, this one was only for white students. George was very disappointed, but he kept reading and learning on his own. On a visit to Iowa, George met a family that encouraged him to go to the local college. In 1887, George started taking classes at Simpson College. He was only the second African American student to go there. He studied art and music, but George wanted to study plants and farming. He switched to Iowa State Agricultural College, where he learned about crops, soils, fertilizers, farm animals, and more. George Carver was only the second African American to go to Simpson College. A great teaching career begins. George was a top student at Iowa State. After he graduated, he was asked to stay and teach. He also began doing research about plants and their many uses. Soon, scientists around the country heard about George and his plant studies. One day, a letter arrived at George's office from the famous educator Booker T. Washington, who had started a school for African Americans in Alabama called the Tuskegee Institute. It was a signal that George Washington Carver's life was about to change forever. Tuskegee Institute's aim was to help African Americans get an education. Carver worked with farmers to improve the way they grew crops. Booker T. Washington wanted Carver to start up a new agricultural program at Tuskegee. He knew that most African Americans in the South were farmers. Teaching them about farming was the best way to improve their lives. Carver accepted the job, even though it paid little. Helping poor farmers. There were many poor African American farmers in the South. They had been growing only cotton for so many years it had ruined the soil at their farms. The farmers also had problems with insects that were eating their crops. Carver taught the farmers better ways to farm. He wrote simple booklets for them and held meetings to teach them how to improve their crops. He also taught them how to grow healthful foods. The primary idea in all of my work was to help the farmer and fill the poor man's empty dinner pail. George Washington Carver. Carver believed in using natural products to improve soils and help plants grow. He wanted farmers to plant crops such as peanuts and sweet potatoes that made the soil healthier. Crops such as peanuts had another advantage. Insects didn't eat them. But that gave Carver another problem to solve. If so many farmers grew peanuts and sweet potatoes, he would have to find more ways to use these crops. Carver experimented in his laboratory. He used simple gadgets and processes to make hundreds of new products from these crops. All of these things could help the farmers make money in new ways. Carver worked in his laboratory to invent new uses for common farm crops. Fame follows. Carver's work made him famous across the country. The United States government asked him to work on plant products. He was even offered a job by Thomas Edison, famous for his invention of the electric light bulb. But Carver chose to stay at Tuskegee and continue his work to improve the lives of farmers. Carver kept working and teaching into his 70s. George Washington Carver died in 1943 at the age of 79. He was buried at Tuskegee Institute. The following words were written on his gravestone. They say what is most important about this great man. He could have added fortune to fame, but caring for neither, he found happiness and honor in being helpful to the world. The United States Postal Service honored Carver with a stamp. The Life of George Washington Carver, 1864. Born in Missouri, 1877. Attends school. 1884. Completes high school. 1891 to 1896. Attends college. 1896. Begins work at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. 1921. Carver's speech to the U.S. Congress about uses of the peanut makes him famous. 1940. Carver donates all his money to Tuskegee Institute for agricultural research. 1943. Dies at the age of 79. Responding. Target skill. Main idea and details. Copy the chart below. Fill in 2 details from this biography that support the main idea shown in the chart. Write about it. Text to world. What did you find most interesting about George Washington Carver? Write a paragraph that gives your opinion. Be sure to include a main idea and support it with details. Target vocabulary. Electric. Experiment. Gadgets. Genius. Invention. Laboratory. Occasional. Signal. Target skill. Main ideas and details. Tell important ideas and details about a topic. Target strategy. Summarize. Tell the important parts of the text in your own words. Genre. A biography tells about events in a person's life, written by another person.